Good evening and welcome to the Monday, February 28th, 2022 Plan Commission and Commission for Citizen Involvement meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order now. Iris, would you please call the roll?
Buchanan is excused. Heap?
Here.
Leak? Here. Pepe?
Here.
Phillips?
Here.
Rigby?
Here.
Stewart?
Here.
Thank you. We have quorum. First on our agenda tonight is a council update. We got note that Councilor Manns wouldn't be able to join us tonight, but she'll be able to join us probably at our next meeting. So we'll move on to item number 4 on our agenda. This is a public comment. This is regarding issues not on the agenda. It's an opportunity to have to raise issues regarding planning. A time limit of 3 minutes per individual applies. Iris, was there anyone who wished to make public comment tonight?
No, we had no one sign up.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to item number 5 on our agenda. This is Commission for Citizen Involvement, general updates. The commissioners tonight did receive a notice from the Holiday Heights Neighborhood Association meeting that their annual meeting will be held Wednesday, March 16th at 6:30 p.m. in the Holiday schoolyard. The topics that they plan on discussing are leadership elections, neighborhood enhancement grant ideas, the Holiday Woods, and then anything else that members may wish to discuss. So we encourage everybody to attend the Holiday Heights Neighborhood Association meeting if you're in the Holiday Heights neighborhood. Again, that's March 16th at 6:30 p.m. in the Holiday schoolyard. Commissioners, any other updates anybody wishes to make on Commission for Citizen Involvement? I can make a couple comments. I did get some feedback that the community is very interested in looking at our goals. Last meeting we had, Councilor Manns talked about the council goals and then directed a lot of people to look at the Lake Oswego review. There was some feedback that, what about the Plan Commission goals? It wasn't really specified by the council, or the Lake Oswego didn't have details in that. So as we look forward to 2022 this year, there seems to be a lot of interest from the community in the goals, but I think that's coming up in our March. So we look forward to engaging with the public on that as we discuss our goals in 2022. So I'll move on to the next agenda item. This is item number 6, minutes, the January 10th, 2022 meeting minutes. Commissioners, are there any changes, clarifications for the January 10th, 2022 meeting minutes? I see Vice Chair Pepe has none. Commissioner Phillips, none.
No.
Is there a motion to approve the January 10th, 2022 meeting minutes?
I'll move to approve the minutes as is.
Thank you. Second? Second. Right. Vice Chair Pepe, a move to approve the minutes as is. Commissioner Leek, seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any nays? None. Any abstains? None. Minutes are approved. Next are the minutes for February 14th, 2022. Any changes, corrections that commissioners would like to make?
The January 14th minutes are
February
pushed out to the next meeting.
Oh, February 14th, or
Yes.
pushed out to the next meeting. Okay, sorry about that. We'll review that at the next meeting then. So then we'll move on to our item number 7 on our agenda. This is the work session. This is the residential demolition and non-conforming development, PP 22-0002. Public comments are accepted. The commission will review options prepared by staff for revising the definition of demolition as recommended by the Middle Housing Code Advisory Committee and amending certain community development code regulations for non-conforming development in residential zones. The staff coordinator is Scot Siegel, community development director. Director Siegel, would you like to open our discussion on?
Yeah, good evening. Thank you, Chair Heap, members of the Planning Commission. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge and welcome our guests and our fellow teammates who are here this evening to participate in the work session. And as we get started, I think we'll just have them come up, and if that's all right with you, Chair. So we have our building official, Brian Don, is here, along with Jessica Numanagu, our planning manager, is online. She's joining us. We also have planning staff, Jessica Maury Collins, and Courtney Sims is here, and Carol Oker, who was is here, as you know, Neighborhood Association Chairs Committee and representative of the first edition Forest Hills neighborhood. And just by way of background, this topic of demolition and the definition of demolition specifically, and how that relates to how the city manages what are referred to as non-conforming developments, and we'll get into sort of all of those technical definitions in a moment. This topic came up during the course of the Middle Housing Code Advisory Committee's work, which Commissioner Leek will recall from early on. One of the policy issues that committee looked at was, expecting that we'll see more middle housing developed in the city. The city will be permitting that through its zoning regulations as we implement House Bill 2001. The committee was interested in looking at strategies that would encourage the retention of existing housing to the extent that it might be feasible to convert the housing to middle housing units, as opposed to demolishing single-family homes and replacing those with middle housing. I think as the committee, and Commissioner Lee can, of course, add on to this, but I think as you were looking at that, there are a number of policy issues that arose there. The city has a demolition tax that applies where homes are demolished, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment, but there's clearly a distinction between demolition and remodel, and even very significant remodels are not classified as demolitions and do not trigger this demolition tax. So that was one of the dimensions of this I think the Middle Housing Committee was thinking about, and thinking that there's that financial incentive or disincentive that is out there today, albeit perhaps not very strong toward retaining existing housing. And I think the committee looked at this from a development code perspective, which is really sort of that was their charge, was to look at the development code and the land use regulations that we would apply to middle housing. I think it occurred to all of us that there's really a really important relationship to how we sort of define demolition, and at what point someone decides to replace an existing dwelling versus attempting to remodel it, and in that way retaining what rights they might have to a non-conforming development. If it's a structure that's not meeting current code in terms of setbacks or other dimensional requirements, there are some advantages to remodeling. And so this definition of demolition and really how we regulate or define the continuation of non-conforming developments, those two concepts are really intertwined. And depending on how you configure the code and set the tax and do a number of other policy choices, you can either encourage remodels, or you can encourage demolition, or discourage remodels, and by default see more demolition. So the committee did not get into the tax question, and really just I think raise this as a policy option or a strategy that the city might want to pursue. And when the city council received the advisory committee's recommendations for middle housing, I think the council was interested in taking a look at this definition of demolition and really how we regulate that. But looking at that perhaps apart from the middle housing code amendments, it's really the council's direction was to comply with the minimum requirements of House Bill 2001, but also consider tools that would help really achieve their goal, which I'm going to ask Ms. Caleb if you could bring up the presentation, and then we'll be able to refer to that. The council's goal and our priority, of course, is to conserve the community's quality of life, by planning for change and growth. And so in terms of middle housing, the council, was very explicit and said that we should be looking at strategies that would help retain neighborhood character and livability, and really, from a land use perspective or a design perspective, trying to help that along. So the Middle Housing Committee looked at demolition and non-conforming development is perhaps one area that we should examine, but doing that apart from the Middle Housing Code Amendment so that we could just look at that independently, recognizing that it could involve these other policy choices like the tax and building code and process and how we regulate that. So what I'd like to do at this point is just have our staff and Ms. Oakert, if you would, maybe Carol, if you don't mind, come up, and Brian. And as we kind of go through our presentation tonight, what I wanted to do for the commission is, one, have the team give you an overview of this question that they've looked at, because we pulled together a work group that included the folks here, along with a builder in the community named Rob Matthews, who has a lot of experience with infill and redevelopment and middle housing. And we really just asked the group to look at this and look at all the different dimensions of this, how we currently regulate development and demolitions, how other communities approach the same questions, what some of the strengths of our existing process are, what some of the areas that we could improve, and I think they've come up with some good approaches. So what we'd like to do is start off by having Carol, if you would say just a few words about from your perspective. I think it's really important that we really have from the neighborhood's perspective and just how this is occurring in the neighborhood. And please, if you would go ahead and just maybe make some introductory comments if you have any.
So I appreciate you allowing me to participate in a somewhat more informal way this evening. And just to reiterate again, I'm the chair of the Citywide Neighborhood Chairs Committee, and we meet every other month to discuss issues of concern that's citywide. And I served on the Middle Housing Committee with Commissioner Leake. I'm also land use liaison for Fan Forest Hills, and so I've done numerous pre-apps over the years. And I have been watching your HB 2001 work sessions, and I want to just say that I really appreciate all of the discussion that you've been having and your commentary and your recommendations. The neighborhood chairs are concerned that our current code allows what's clearly a demolition of a building to be categorized as a remodel of that building. And as staff will show you in their presentation, there are some basic problems that result from that for neighborhoods. When the demolition tax aspect was raised during the Middle Housing Committee meetings, Bob Irvin, the chair of Uplands, and I, who were both on there, lobbied to make sure that we also address the neighborhood land use aspect, and the Middle Housing Committee agreed. The council agreed, so here we are this evening. And I want to do what I can to help you understand the problems that we're having from a neighborhood perspective. When it's a demolition, we need to have it categorized as a demolition, and then we need follow through with associated good code that's going to bring us good outcome for projects and for neighborhoods. And you'll also hear later, even HB 2001 comes into play when we get to the topic of conversions. And so I hope tonight that I can just give you some concepts in practical terms as we move through some of the examples. And thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And so really the order of operations here and what we had in mind is that we would provide this background on existing definitions and process, go through some plan examples, and Jessica Maury-Collins will walk through some examples of really what this looks like at the plan review stage, because that's really where we have to apply the code, and where the way the regulations are set up or how they're structured can really make a difference in terms of the outcomes that that Carol's talking about. And then some options and a possible approach for the Planning Commission to consider. And really what we're looking for is your direction on the concepts and also the process. So, this potentially could be a topic that is of broad, community interest and concern too. So we want to make sure that we're, using the right approach and it's ready to move forward when it is. And then we'll kind of wrap up with the schedule and next steps and any guidance that the commission has on that. So With that, I think what I'd like to do before Brian kind of goes over the building code, building department process and what that looks like is just to show you what the definition is, and it's in the staff report too. So as you can see, we created a permit process for demolitions in 2016. The city previously had not instituted anything other than what was then, I think, a plumbing permit for capping and decommissioning a sewer line. In 2016, the demolition process was adopted, and it created a notification process for neighbors, among other things, but it did not include a tax at that point. In 2019, the tax was adopted, and that was put in place really, the council's intent was specifically to raise revenue for parks maintenance. And so the ordinance does refer to other concerns or public policy objectives as far as trying to retain existing lower cost, naturally occurring lower cost housing. But really the main reason that was put in place was to raise revenue for parks, which it has done. And we, over the past year, I think approved approximately 30 demolition permits. And so at $15,000 per demolition, it's raising between $400,000 and $500,000 a year. And we only, we expect that only to increase as, the number of vacant lots diminishes and we see more demolition. So it is a significant, source of revenue for parks. But as you can see, the definition of, what is a demolition is very forgiving. And I think you'll see some examples of what this looks like on a set of plans. But really, you can remove almost the entire structure and it's still considered to be a remodel. And that's really the kind of the takeaway here, that if we're trying to retain or maintain neighborhood character, is a remodel that is allowed to deconstruct or remove that much of a structure, really achieving that goal of neighborhood character or some recognizable remnant of the house that was there. So I think we came to the agreement that it's really not achieving that goal, but that's why we're here, is to get your feedback on that. Here's a remodel. As you can see, there's one wall left standing there, and there are other examples that you'll see here where it is a very forgiving code, and it was I think crafted that way because it does provide flexibility for owners to do additions and remodels, and it does afford a great deal of flexibility. And there are a large number of lots in the town that are either non-conforming as to their size, or the development that is on those lots is non-conforming in one way or another, because our codes have evolved over the past 60, 70 years, I think. And over time, the city's code has become obviously more complex, and it's addressing more contemporary planning and urban design issues of today. So I think that was intentional, that the ordinance was created in that way, that it is flexible. I think the question, or really for the community today, is it time to recalibrate that, given the kind of the pressure for redevelopment and demolitions that we're seeing now, and the style of housing and the scale of housing that's being constructed. So we'll come back to these, but I just wanted to give you kind of a snapshot of the concepts, the high-level concepts that this group is developing, and we'll come back to these. And it's really redefining demolition in some way that relates to a threshold or the goal to retain at least a certain portion of the shell of a house, so that it's in some way recognizable, and it's not just one wall or a portion of a wall that's left standing. We would also want to clarify what constitutes maintenance, because this has created some difficulties in administering the code, and also for homeowners who are trying to remodel, and just understanding how much or what type of structural work they can do that would be classified as maintenance versus altering a non-conforming structure in some way that would no longer be permitted. And that's really the key issue with maintenance. We're looking at some process improvements here, including a pre-submittal meeting, possibly a pre-application conference that would provide information to builders up front on kind of what the situation is where they have a non-conforming development. And so they understand that these are sort of the parameters around which you can remodel a non-conforming development, or alternatively, you're going to be in the sort of the process of demolition where the requirements are different. So we're also looking at submittal requirements, plan submittal requirements that would help staff, builders, neighbors, and really, all of these stakeholders be able to clearly articulate what the plan is if it is a remodel and it's not a complete demolition. What is the design intent? What are the engineering plans and calculations supporting that? And so we have some confidence when we look at a plan for a remodel that it's feasible. And then finally, we're looking at some inspections of these building projects as they're in process, so that we have quality control on that, and we're not in a situation where a builder is has gone too far and is in a position of having to resubmit plans and possibly start over again, which is not really in anyone's interest. So those are some of the high-level concepts, and again, we'll come back to those, but first, unless there are any questions from the commissioners, I'd like for Brian to kind of give us a summary of kind of what the process looks like from the building
Director
department.
Siegel, I think there may be questions.
Okay.
I had one question. Was in the first slide, it talked about the current definition, and it mentioned superstructure. In the pictures that followed, what's our definition of a superstructure? Because in all the pictures, it didn't look like anything was above kind of that bottom floor, perimeter walls. Is the attic a superstructure, or and then in the last slide that you showed, it talked about concepts using perimeter walls and things, but it didn't talk about superstructure at all. So I'm just wondering, how does superstructure play today, and is that something that we're considering?
I think that's an excellent question for Mr. Don.
Yeah.
So unless there are other questions for me,
So removal of the superstructure would be, there's nothing there. You do not even see the house that was there. It's completely leveled. And that's why they have that definition in there, because of the types of construction. It was done way back when. I mean, sometimes, and as you notice in the third definition, it talks about removal of all the exterior perimeter foundation. There are some homes that don't even have a foundation, some really old ones. So that's why we have to touch base on each of these types of descriptions to really consider it a definition of demolition, because of the way some homes are built. It's another way of saying, hey, you know what? Yes, they've definitely removed the entire superstructure of this building. And this definition also applies to commercial on some of that other stuff. So, you're looking at a commercial building, you're looking at the superstructure of the commercial building. So there's a lot of different stuff. You may have a slab there that's left, but the rest of the building's gone. Like a slab on grade type foundation.
Yeah, but a slab with nothing on top of it it's considered to have a superstructure then and be compliant?
Well, no, it would be a demoed building.
Oh, okay. And in the picture that's currently shown, it says this is not demolition, but it looks like there's no superstructure. There's nothing above the perimeter walls.
Well, there's no roof structure on that, but the perimeter walls are there. So a portion or partial of that superstructure is still standing.
So the superstructure, as I understand it, is anything above the foundation.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So this is above the foundation.
Yes.
So that's.
Yeah, and those are ors, so 1, 2, or 3.
Okay. Yeah, I think with that definition, if the superstructure definition is anything above the foundation, then it's understandable through the pictures. Okay.
So, I guess it's my turn. So I just kind of want to give some background on the state building codes division leaves it up to the jurisdiction to define and permit demolitions. They don't have a definition themselves. They pulled it out of the code back in 2016. And so it used to be in the state building code, but then they decided we're going to leave that up to each jurisdiction to decide what that is and what the definition is. And so I just kind of wanted to touch on that. And I kind of wanted to go over what the building department here at Lake Oswego does for a demolition permit. Currently, we require the applicant to pay, if they're going to demo a house, the $15,000 demo tax. Now, if they're going to deconstruct it, they get a discount of $5,000 off of that $15,000, which creates only a $10,000 tax for them. We require, we're going to call it a state hazmat certification, or basically an asbestos investigation or inspection to certify whether the home has asbestos or no asbestos in it. We collect that before we issue the permit. We make sure we have it in hand. It's required for us to collect it for homes built before 2004. There's a 14-day notice that is given to the, is it mailed out, Scott?
Yeah, mailed to the abutting property owners, and then there's a notice that's posted on the property itself.
Posted on the property. New construction meets current community development code, variance, minor variance, or design review required for adjustments to code standards. So that's when you're building the new construction after you've completely demoed the house. There's the other section where, you know, if you were going to remodel or renovate the home, there's no $15,000 demo tax or $10,000 for deconstruction. The state hazmat certification is still required. There's no incentive to deconstruct and salvage the materials currently. No neighbor notice or sign is required, except if there's a variance involved in the process. They may continue non-conforming parts of the development, parts that were lawfully established but do not meet current community development code standards without a variance. And that's where we're talking where a wall is left up in a setback that has been created greater. And so they tend to want to leave those walls up to preserve the placement of the footings and where the home is currently. I can't think of anything else, Scott, do you?
Yeah, no, that's really very comprehensive. Do the commissioners have any questions for Brian before we'll have Jessica talk about the other side of this equation, which is the sort of the definition or the regulation of non-conforming development. Any
Okay,
questions?
that's what I was asking.
Okay, we're going to go there next, but any questions for Brian? And I think we'll have you stay up here for now as we go.
Commissioner Stewart?
What are the requirements for deconstruction? Is the builder or homeowner required to reuse all of the deconstructed materials, or can it be repurposed some other way?
Currently, they have to hire a certified contractor from the city of Portland on their list for deconstruction. They have a program at the city of Portland. So we require that they've been certified through that city of Portland process, and they have to, they can't use any machinery to dismantle the home. And at the end of the deconstruction process, they provide us with a report of all the board feet, and these contractors, the ones that do this, they do this all the time. That's all they do. So they submit, and we file that in the file as proof of what they've done, what they've saved, and what had to go to the landfill went to the landfill. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and the commission may have seen that the Sustainability Advisory Board submitted a letter, and did we get that out, Iris? Thank you. And so at their recent meeting, they were discussing, options or ways that the city might be able to encourage greater use of that program, or perhaps even require it, as the city of Portland does. So that's really I think a separate, kind of policy issue that SAB and the city council will, maybe considering, but I wanted you to be aware of it. It doesn't really affect the development code at all, but something that is relevant here. So with that, I think I'd like to ask Jessica Numanagu, our planning manager, to give us an overview of non-conforming development and what some of the challenges are with that.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Jessica Numanagu, Planning Manager. glad to be here this evening, and I apologize. I have a cold that I'm just trying to get over, so if I cough in the middle, please excuse me. But yeah, I'm going to talk about what our current regulations are for nonconformity and how it relates to demolition. And as Brian talked about, the demolition, as it's defined in the building code, really gets at whether or not the tax needs to be paid and whether or not there's any notice that needs to be provided to surrounding neighbors. But it really is interrelated with our non-conforming standards, which are in the Community Development Code. It's in LOC 50.01.006. And the reason they're interrelated is because, as many folks tonight have already alluded to, when they try to either avoid doing the demo tax or they just want to retain a nonconformity, they're leaving up a portion of the structure that doesn't comply with current code. And that has some ramifications. But first of all, let's talk about what is nonconforming development, just to make sure we're all on the same page and have an understanding. So nonconforming structures are going to be structures that were initially lawfully established when they were constructed, but due to a code change, or sometimes if another property is annexed into the city and it was under different standards, it doesn't comply with current code. And a really good example of this, for those of you who are familiar with the infill standards that were adopted in about 2003, before 2003, we had as our zoning standards really just lot coverage, setbacks, and height. Those were the standards that we looked at. After the infill standards were adopted, it introduced a whole menu of different building and site design standards that we look at. Things like garage appearance and location, front yard setback plane, side yard setback plane, floor area ratio, et cetera, et cetera. So when we introduced those standards, it made a lot of existing homes non-conforming because those weren't originally built according to those standards. So we have lots and lots of non-conforming structures throughout the city, particularly along the lake. And the whole purpose of the non-conforming section in the Community Development Code is really to allow retention and basic maintenance of existing non-conforming structures, but eventually to get compliance when remodeling or demolitions occur. So as an example, if someone has a wall that's inside of a setback, let's say the setback is required to be 10 feet, but the wall is set back 6 feet, they wouldn't be able to, or they'd be able to keep that forever and ever, but if they do any sort of additions or changes, the new addition or changes would need to comply with the code. So in terms of what is currently allowed under our non-conforming standards, number one, as I mentioned before, you can continue, you can keep it as long as you want. You can even make some minor changes. Maybe you re-roof, or maybe you put different siding on, or even punch in a window here or there. But that's pretty much it. You really can't, you can't extend those non-conforming walls. So if you're within the setback, you can't extend it at that same setback line. You can't rebuild it, tear it down and rebuild it. You really have to kind of keep it as is. You can also do some maintenance, although I'm not going to get into the intricacies of that because it gets very complicated fast. If you do any additions, the additions have to fully comply with the code. So in that example where somebody's at a 6-foot setback when it's required to be 10 feet, what they'll have to do is they'll have to add on, they'll have to basically pull that addition into the full 10 feet rather than extend the 6-foot wall. They can also change the roof pitch, and this is something that we've addressed in the proposed draft amendments, where if someone has, for instance, a flat roof, which is not great in this climate, and they want to put a pitched roof on there, before we put in this code exception, they weren't allowed to do that. And it caused a lot of problems because there's a lot of non-conforming garages out there, again, particularly along the lake. And we consider our setbacks to be 3-dimensional. So you can't put new massing on top of a structure that's within a setback because you're creating a new nonconformity, a 3-dimensional nonconformity. So this outright permitted exception in the nonconforming section says you can change the roof pitch on a nonconforming structure so long as you don't increase the roof height by more than 6 feet and you don't exceed the base zone height. And that's great, but we've had some problems with that where people actually want to change the wall height and then change the roof pitch and make a taller ceiling height. So the code amendments that were drafted that for your review today would kind of address that to make sure that folks understand that it's really above the top plate that you can change the roof pitch. You can't make the wall taller and then change the roof pitch. And another important thing to know about our non-conforming standards is that if you have some sort of a natural disaster that causes your house to be, destroyed, say a fire or flood or earthquake or something like that, the code allows in those instances for the house to be rebuilt fully to the extent that it was non-conforming previously. And that's great. But when you do when you have an intentional demolition, which is what you would do as part of a remodel or a demolition of your house, whatever you build back has to fully conform. And so what we see is that people want to retain some non-conforming portions. There's some advantages to that. One advantage might be avoiding the demo tax. Another advantage might be that maybe they get to have a wider house if they retain a wall that's within a setback and then they demolish the rest of it. The other side will have to comply with the setbacks, but they can get a wider house if they kind of keep that non-conforming wall that's already within the setback. So there's reasons why people do that. And our code, as Scott had mentioned before, is pretty generous today. It allows you to do something like just leaving up one wall. But there are some issues for you to consider tonight. And the issues are from the perspective of the neighborhood, from the perspective of the review that's done by staff, and from the perspective of the applicant. And as far as the neighborhood perspective goes, the issue is that when folks just leave a couple of non-conforming walls, and as you've seen already in some of these examples, the extent of the demolition that's done, what they rebuild back is unrecognizable, right? It's not really a remodel. I mean, for all practical purposes, it's a full demolition. And I think what's jarring to the neighborhood is that they would expect that if you're demolishing to that extent, that whatever you rebuild, everything should have to conform to the code, because you're essentially getting a brand new dwelling. Otherwise, they're not only getting a brand new dwelling, but they also have to live with some past nonconformities that of course, once you've kind of rebuilt most of the dwelling, those are really going to be there longer term, right? Because they've put a lot of investment into rebuilding it. So it's just not going to go away anytime soon. From a perspective of staff review, what we find is when folks turn in their plans and they have to show compliance with the non-conforming standards, which means that if they're going to save a wall, they have to save that wall. They can't tear it down and rebuild it. It has to stay. Excuse me. It's really hard to read that in the plans. As planners, we review all plans. We are not plans examiners. And so there are things that we may not catch that are happening. They may be removing, or we may not be understanding the full scope of the project. So at the very least, we'll have to go and consult with building staff. And sometimes it can be hard for them to decipher or even be able to tell us, yeah, I think this is feasible, and still being able to save that wall. Because sometimes you're like, how are they really doing this? They're saving this portion of the wall. Is that really feasible? And so from staff's perspective, it's really hard to review those plans. And then once we have approved and issued the permit, from the applicant's perspective, the issue is that sometimes they'll go out there and they'll find that after they've demolished or partially demolished what they're going to remove, what's left over may have dry rot, or it may have other structural issues. Sometimes we've had an instance where someone didn't even have a foundation, or it was completely inadequate. And they didn't know that ahead of time. Or we've had situations where the contractor just either didn't understand the plans or didn't care and just demolished the whole thing anyway, or demolished more than they were supposed to. That's happened quite frequently. So when that happens, it puts the applicant in a hard spot, because they either have to, because they've intentionally demolished it, it's gone, they can't rebuild it. They either need to redesign the whole project, which of course at the stage where you've got a building permit and you're ready to construct, that's pretty terrible news. Or they have to stop and apply for a variance, which obviously will delay their project. And that's if a variance is even feasible for what it is that they're proposing. So those are kind of the main issues from kind of different perspectives that we're dealing with nonconformities and how it relates to what we define as a demolition going forward. Jessica Morey-Collins is going to provide some specific examples. So she'll give you examples in photos and plan views so that it'll kind of help better illustrate the issues that we deal with. But before we get to that, does anybody have any question in general about non-conforming definitions and anything to do with non-conformities?
Commissioner Lee?
My question is, if we change the code to 50 or 80% or whatever the percentage is that is taken away from the existing structure, and then it becomes the definition of a demolition, does that make your job any easier?
Well, I think I don't know that it makes it easier. I think that that in itself is not what's going to make it easier. It's the other items that we included in the draft amendments, which would be things like, having the pre-application conference so that everybody understands what the requirements are, requiring them to submit detailed plans and a structural engineer that verifies that whatever's left over that they're retaining is feasible. I think, and then also having the inspection after the demolition too. I think those will make things easier. But I do think that by instituting that percentage, that is going to discourage this practice of saving one or two walls. I do think it will have a big impact on that, and we may see less of that.
Do you think that with these stricter standards, everyone will just go to demolition, period? They won't even try to save a structure. They'll just say, well, what the heck, I'm going to have to subscribe to that, just take the whole thing down.
Yeah, that's hard to say because we have a fair number of folks who just put additions on what they have. They don't really have much demolition other than what they need to put an addition on. I don't know that I could speculate very accurately on that. I can tell you we see a variety of projects in terms of the scope and the scale of the demolition. But we do have a fair number of projects where people do genuinely keep most of the dwelling and are just adding on to it.
Yeah, we did look at a sort of a sample of residential structural permits to see, like, of those that are additions where they're adding floor area, what percentage of those were remodels of non-conforming structures, where there might be some incentive to preserve that one wall, and it was about a third. It was like, I think there were 30 or so additions, and about 10 or 11 of those were with non-conforming structures. So really, one of the things that I was thinking about when the group was discussing this metric or the standard is, it has to be substantial. It has to be, having that margin in there, whether it's 50% or 80% or something else, is, I think, going to give us higher quality control than we have with just like, it could be this much of the wall, 3 studs and top plate, and so having that degree of I guess certainty or requirement in there is there's still a margin of error.
As a realtor for the last 35 years here, it's always been a joke in the real estate community that you could call it a remodel with one wall left standing, and mostly the lake properties again, because the smaller lots and that want the new setback, so it makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you. Jessica, did you have anything else to add? Or
I think, sorry, Dr. Siegel, I think we have more questions.
Okay.
There's actually more of a comment. I think what might get lost in this discussion, and I'm not saying this would happen all the time, but I think one of the reasons that folks may choose to retain certain portions of a structure is to save costs, right? So yeah, you may have a wall that is unconforming, but if you can reuse the foundation and reuse the framing, that saves a lot more money than tearing that down, having to excavate the foundation, pull it all out, haul it away and then pour new concrete. So I know that's probably not the case all the time, but that's, should be a consideration.
Thanks. So, Chair, were there any other questions?
Yeah, maybe one more question for planning manager Namanalu. You talked about the scenario where a contractor maybe didn't understand the plans and they inadvertently tore down more than they were supposed to. And you mentioned then their options may be to ask for a variance. Were you talking in the same light of did they also ask them maybe to abandon the traditional process and go to a RID process? Does that happen too, or?
Yeah, we do see, we have had instances where a house or either the wall was not able to be saved because it wasn't structurally or sound, or it was damaged, or a contractor inadvertently removed the whole wall, in which case they've applied for RID variances. In one instance, on Country Club Court, they actually were in the midst of getting a RID variance for another part of the dwelling, tore down more than they were supposed to, and then ended up revising that variance to include the sections that were torn down that weren't supposed to be. So yeah, I think that is a common, if that does happen, the common remedy is they'll apply for a variance.
All right, thank you.
Good. Thank you, Jessica. Chair,
No more questions.
okay. So with that, I'll ask Jessica
Sorry,
Mori
does somebody have a
Collins.
question? I didn't see. Commissioner Phillips, did you have a question?
I do.
Oh, I see. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. That was very helpful. Basic question is, obviously, gaming the system is in play in here by developers, potential homeowners, whatever. So is that very obvious to you and the planning people that are issuing the permit that this is a system, this is one that's trying to be gamed or not? Is that pretty obvious pretty quickly?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by gamed. I mean, I don't know if they're trying to avoid the demolition tax or if they genuinely want to retain a non-conforming wall. But I think in a lot of cases, it's both. It could be both, because there are advantages to retaining non-conforming walls that allows you more flexibility in if you're doing a major or substantial remodel. But that's allowed by code. I wouldn't say they're gaming the system in that way, because our code allows that. So it's perfectly legal for them to do that. But it might be a combination of retaining a non-conforming portion so they have, I guess, greater flexibility, and also avoiding the $15,000 demolition tax, because you don't, as the pictures had shown, you don't have to leave much up to avoid paying the demolition tax.
Right, I understand that what you're saying, but gaming the system means to me is there a potential for trying to avoid the tax? And as Commissioner Leek indicated, it was a joke to some people, and so like, it sounds like it's pretty straightforward. You can see that, hey, this is going to have an impact, and that's why we're here tonight, is try to avoid these kind of things and keep some of the flavor of the house. Okay. So, and the second thing is, once a permit is issued, you know, I understand that when the guy comes in, he probably, you know, the guy that's actually doing the destruction or whatever, you know, taking down the parts that he thinks he's supposed to. I understand mistakes happen and everything, but I would hope that, you know, just because you made a mistake doesn't mean you get to go scot-free. Okay, you got to stop. And is the permit then automatically rejected, or it's just no longer valid? Is that true?
So what we do is and we've done this plenty of times, we have plenty of examples, is we put a stop work order on it. So it stops them from doing any further work, and then they have to come up with a solution as to how they're going to address that. Again, it could be redesign of the project. It could be apply for a variance, but we will not take that stop work order off until they've basically received their variance or submit plans that comply.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
No further questions, I see.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Heap. I'm going to hand this over to Jessica Mori Collins. And I think while you're looking at these examples, maybe have in the back of your mind that, any I guess, standards, limitations, or allowances, that we either impose or afford, to single-family development, the city must also afford the same, I guess, privileges or impose the same limitations on middle housing, in the zones where it's allowed. So the middle housing rules do, and Eric Olson, I think, has presented this to you before, that there are rules that address additions to or conversions of an existing detached single-family dwelling. And basically what the rules say is that any zone or any place, any lot, that the code would allow a single-family home addition, we must also allow, in addition to, create middle housing or to develop middle housing from an existing dwelling. Conversion is something else. Conversion is, we're viewing that as internal to the shell, that it's not adding. It's not additive, it's converting, within an existing shell. And what the rules say that, I'll just read it, additions to or conversions of an existing detached single-family dwelling into middle housing is allowed in the city pursuant to the rule, provided that the addition or conversion does not increase nonconformance with applicable clear and objective standards. So, just as we're obligated to allow middle housing where single-family housing or additions are allowed, we can also control that in terms of not allowing expansion of non-conforming developments. So, however we define demolition and, however we, I guess, regulate the continuation of non-conforming developments, that will also apply to redevelopment or I guess conversions and additions to middle housing. So I just wanted to bring that up because it did come from the Middle Housing Committee and was one of the reasons that they wanted you to look at this. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Jessica.
All right, am I on? Is the mic on? Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, the light is on. So this is the site at 481 Country Club that we just were speaking about with the RID variance. There was an initial variance to approve an attached patio at the setback, the rear setback for an accessory structure. And during the deconstruction process, they found, I'm not sure if they, inadvertently removed more than they were supposed to on a non-conforming wall or had some barrier that they discovered to retaining the non-conforming portions of the structure as they originally intended, but they did have to legalize that through a variance. And this gives you a bit of a sense of just the footprint, so the existing footprint shown in green, a little over 2,000 square feet, and then about 90 square feet removed, and 424 square feet of new development proposed. And here's the existing elevations, give you a sense of the structure that was on the site. And that kind of the rear elevation, which I think is the west elevation, is the portion of the structure that kind of extended into that rear setback. And here's the proposed elevations, and then, just a sort of high-level visual representation of how much of the structure was shown on these elevations as retained existing versus new, totally new structures. And I think part of that, if I remember correctly, they had a tree fall on a portion of the structure, and so they had some changes to plans, but yeah, it gives a sense of about how much of the structure is kept versus new on this particular site. Here's the foundation plan, again color-coded for existing structure that's retained through the demolition and then new portions of the structure that are added. So a pretty good amount of the existing foundation retained as existing and portion of it new. And then here's an assessment more focused on the nonconformity issue. So again, kind of highlighting that area that's nonconforming and those couple other points where the building sort of extends out of the building envelope. And then here's the existing elevations, highlighting the non-conforming portions of the structure. And then these are the proposed elevations showing the non-conforming portions of the structure. It's a little bit different angles since the lot had, I think, 5 sides, but you kind of get a sense of what they were keeping of the non-conforming portion.
If I could just sort of comment here, because Country Club Court is in Van Forest Hills. So I participated in the original pre-application hearing where it was about adding a covered patio. And so we understood that there was going to be a small RID process on that. And then the chair of the neighborhood association happened to notice and asked me why the entire building had been removed. And that's how this started. And so the photo that I passed out there is what it actually looked like on the site with the small garage off to the side. I went and talked to the building contractor who was on the site that day, told him I was checking it out to make sure things were going to be going along according to plan. And he said, well, it's going to go a lot easier now that we've removed the walls. At one point towards the end of this process, the applicant, the owner of the site, was at our neighborhood association board meeting. We asked him why the walls had been taken down as they were, and his answer was that the contractor did not tell him that they were going to take down the walls. So the reason for giving you this anecdotal story of it is to show you the importance of getting this code more clear, more reasonable, and more sensible, so that the frustrations that happened with this, and this was a very, very frustrated applicant by the time he was at our neighborhood association board meeting several months later. We don't want this to be difficult for anyone involved. We want this to be clear, we want it to be fair, and we want it to work for the neighbors as well as the applicant, for everyone involved. So thank you for your help on this, and hopefully that will, if you have any questions on that, we can all help with that. Thanks.
Okay, so the next site is 1948 Maple Leaf Road. They're all major remodels under the current code. And this is, again, starting with the footprint, just looking at the amount of the footprint that's existing, the amount of the footprint of the proposed structure that's new. And then you look at the foundation plan and can see a little bit more, even though the footprint itself is existing, it was on site, the portions of the structure that are proposed for retention, at least at the foundation level, were pretty minimal on this site. So the green areas, the wall at the back. When we get into the building envelope, you can kind of see why they kept that portion of the structure, which is that it was non-conforming to the rear yard setback. So they, proposed to retain the non-conforming portions of the existing structure at the foundation level, and then pretty much everything else was new. And then here's the site photo of the demolition. I think we've already shown this, but to kind of give you the context on that review, that project, and a little bit of what was going on this site. The next site we'll discuss is 764 2nd Street, another major remodel, and this is a kind of segment of the site plan showing what walls are proposed for retention and then other portions of the structure that are proposed for demolition. And then here's the foundation plan showing a similar breakdown of what is proposed for retention of existing structures or portions of the structure versus new.
Jessica, sorry to interrupt you, but did this one have any nonconformities?
It did, yeah. So this structure is located in the R6 district in First Edition, in the First Edition neighborhood, which has a requirement that if a site has an alley access, the garage, carport, whatever parking structure they have on site should be located off the alley. So had they completely demolished this structure, they would have had to change their access to off of the alley rather than off of the street. The garage here, which you can see on the floor plan, is shown as retained, is non-conforming to that standard, as well as to the building design, garage and appearance location standards that I think Jessica and others had talked about a little bit with, being kind of newer standards. So there were a couple non-conformities related to the garage specifically, which I think is why that was, or probably one reason that was proposed to be retained.
The other nonconformity, which is really important for R6, in addition to moving the garage to the alley, is that we have a 50% front porch standard, and so this particular project did not conform to our front porch standard either.
And then this is some elevations to kind of show the issues from, that perspective. So again, you can see that the garage highlighted there, and you have the substandard porch based on the dimensional requirements for the porch in this zone. And then here's the proposed elevations. So you can see, where they kept the garage pretty much where it was. Okay, next site is 652 Cabana Lane. This is a major remodel incorporating a suite of nonconformities. This is the original demolition plan that was submitted showing walls that were proposed for retention versus new demolished portions of the structure proposed to be replaced. Here's the foundation plan showing what they proposed to keep in green versus what they were going to build new in purple. And then here's the existing and proposed elevations, existing elevations on the bottom, and then proposed elevations on the top, giving a sense of the wall area that is proposed to be retained versus new. And the opposite elevation. And there's, we'll get into the nonconformities shortly here. Then here's the front elevation, and then you kind of get the elevation both with and without the garage for the front. And then here's the lakeside elevation, existing and proposed. In terms of nonconformities on this site, the existing structure exceeds the allowable lot coverage under the current code standards by about 8%. And the property also is nonconforming to the side yard setback. There's a minimum 15-foot total setback for side yards in this zone. They have 5 feet on each side, so one of the sides would need to meet a 10-foot setback in order to comply. The detached garage or garage accessory structure is non-conforming to the front yard setback as well as to the garage appearance and location standards, both in terms of being closer to the street than the dwelling and taking up more than 60% of the width of the front elevation. And then at the top left corner of the structure, I gave measurement just to give you an idea of about how much they're over their lot coverage. And this is the last site. There's a little bit less analysis on this one, but it's 1041 C Avenue, and this was another major remodel. Photos provided by Carol to give a sense of what was there before. And then again, the demolition process, or non-demolition process, and then the resulting structure. And so here's the site plan for that project, showing a breakdown of the existing footprint versus the new footprint. So you can see it's not a ton of new footprint. They did have a nonconformity to the side yard setback, but it looks like they stepped the upper story back to meet the new requirement. And then here's the demolition plan to illustrate how much of the structure was proposed to be retained versus removed. I think that's the last one. So the issues that come up during plan review, we don't require demolition plans for major remodels, so it's not always easy to assess or determine, what the extent of demolition proposed for a remodel is. It's hard to verify. I think as others have mentioned that, the planning skill set doesn't necessarily comprise of some of the more structural building components that need to be assessed to determine whether a demolition, is a demolition or if it falls into that remodel category. Existing elevations are not always provided. They usually are when there's some kind of, reason of whether they're trying to keep a nonconformity and show how that's being kept. But yeah, it's not a requirement, so it's something, we'd have to ask for. And then there's a lot of different ways to measure these standards, so making sure that whatever the, decision is in terms of redefining these standards, that there's a methodology that's, pretty clear and objective, at least for ministerial plan review purposes. And of course that all takes staff time, so just making sure that these new requirements can be incorporated without, delaying review timelines. And then, making sure that if we have an inspection of deconstruction for remodel, that the timeline is pretty dialed in, since we'd be looking at, the extent of demolition. There's kind of a narrow window between the deconstruction process, but before, the new build starts. And I'm sure that that's a pretty, I imagine that our applicants and customers are eager to get the process moving forward. And then also that, we would, when we try to encourage our applicants to look at, get an engineer input on some of these more structural components related to the deconstruction, so that they don't find themselves in these situations where they deconstruct and then they find something they weren't expecting and have to redesign. And then these are, I think, those same code concepts that we discussed earlier, but can bring those back up for discussion. And if anyone has any questions or thoughts.
Commissioners, any questions? No questions? Vice Chair Pepe.
Yes, my first question, I'll address directly to Ms. Oakrif. Is she still there at the?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Can you succinctly just provide what is your primary concern and objective with this?
You guys spend, how much time we put into, as a community and as a commission, writing code. When someone is basically building a new house, you know it, I know it, the community knows it, then they need to follow the code that is current. And they need to not have, we need to not have a code that allows them to get around doing that. That's a fundamental piece. So in other words, what you saw with the garage code in first edition, having that garage go to the alley is incredibly important to our neighborhood plan. And to have a code that allows basically a new house to be built where they do not have to go to the alley and don't have to provide the front porch, that is a huge step away from a community prepared code. And so when you get to call it a remodel, then that's a problem because you get to avoid that.
So if I hear you correctly, your primary concern would be a remodeled home needs to still adhere to the characteristics of that neighborhood.
It needs to follow the
That-
code. It needs to
Well,
follow
right,
the code.
But for instance, if we were to say, leave it as is, right? And they still follow the code, that wouldn't sit well. So what I'm trying to get to is what is your primary concern and objective? And it sounds like a remodel needs to still adhere to the characteristic of that neighborhood. Is that?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Well, if we pass the code and it still allowed that garage to be moved to the back, and they were adhering to the code,
So
based
if-
on what you were just saying, we would be, it sounds like you would be okay with that, but I don't think that's the case.
So if you came up with a code that require, well, we have a code, if we have a code that says this was a demolition, then they would have to have moved the garage to the back.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Maybe to follow on to Vice Chair Pepe's questions is, how do you see this impacting middle housing? What type of impact or change would it have to middle housing if we put this in and if we didn't make the change? Relative to middle housing?
So certainly with middle housing, we're going to have increased density. And we want to make sure that if something is encroaching into the setback and someone decides to remodel extensively such that they're maintaining that nonconformity, pressing up against the neighbor, then it's potentially a more intensive middle housing use of that property. And so I think it's going to make it even more of a pressure to make sure that what we get as a demolition is truly going to catch all of those sort of issues that we're missing today, because I think it is going to be more impactful.
But do you see with middle housing that there would be this opportunity for more of these scenarios to occur? That, you know, with middle housing, we'd see, you know, cases where they'd leave one wall, to build middle housing, and this would have a bigger impact on the neighborhood. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's fair to say that it is, if you can increase the ability to get more of a footprint, you may well want to do that. And so certainly with middle housing, again, like I said, it's going to be a higher use density-wise of the lot, and the impact on the next door neighbor is going to perhaps be more impactful for them. So all the more reason that we need to get this fixed.
Commissioner Lee?
I agree with what you said totally, and middle housing could be the loophole that gets in infill areas and makes it very uncomfortable for neighbors. And I also go back to the old expression that if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. And if you're taking everything down, it's a demolition. And we really need to tighten these codes up, 50%, 60%, 80%, whatever. It's overdue. We need to do this.
Well, Commissioner Leak, just to follow up on your comment then tying this back to middle housing, then are you saying that middle housing is going to cause more of these scenarios to occur than what we're currently seeing?
No.
And that's a reason why we need to address it?
And I'm really not sure what demolition in middle housing has. I think it's a disconnect personally, but it was brought up during our discussions. I think middle housing in Lake Oswego will be very difficult to achieve, at least affordably. It'll be very expensive if we do it at all. But that apart, demolition needs to be reworked.
Yeah, so I think I'm understanding what you're saying. So you're saying,
But if you did want to do middle housing, if a builder or an owner of a property wanted to do middle housing and subscribe to the remodel model that we have today, yeah, they could do that, and they could do a 2-story duplex next to a neighborhood that's, 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranch, 60s ranch kind of feel. And if they left the existing walls left and right, then they can have 5-foot setbacks as opposed to the new code that would make them be, 10 or whatever it is. So yeah, it could be impactful.
Could be, but you mentioned the term disconnect. Am I understanding correctly then to say that these are independent issues, that we have an issue with our code that relates independently to demolitions from what middle housing?
Yeah, I personally am not connecting the dots.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Stewart?
Yeah, I think, I agree. I don't know that necessarily the number of demolitions or remodels, or whatever you want to call them, will increase, but I do think with middle housing, the impact for each site could be greater. I mean, I think that's the concern, because, maybe you're not talking about more scale, but you're talking about more density, right? So I think that it does give it a greater impact.
Chair Eve, I think, if I may, I think from a middle housing perspective, the only difference with middle housing as far as the state rules go and our obligations under HB 2001 is that the bill and the rules require that we allow conversions of existing single-family dwellings into middle housing. And so I think that, to Carol's point, not, density notwithstanding, there's this question around what is a conversion, and how much of that existing dwelling really needs to be there in order for there to be something to convert, and at what point is it really a replacement dwelling? And that's sort of the theoretical question that I'm grappling with.
All right, thank you, Director Siegel. Commissioner Rigby?
Are we at a juncture to discuss the proposals themselves? Or are either of you equipped to speak as to the proposals themselves?
Yeah, Commissioner Rigsby, I thought we would just, however the chair would like to go through this, these are really just initial concepts. And so really what we're looking for is, and I think this question around how do we calibrate it, and the group felt that, exterior walls is a meaningful metric, some percentage of exterior walls, as well as gross floor area. And those are really, when you go back and look at the definition of demolition, those are the two things that seem to have the biggest impact. And so really, if the commission wanted to just go through those points, and there are really two areas of inquiry. One is this definition of demolition, and then sort of getting some direction around that. And then secondly, if the commission thinks that we're heading in the right direction and regulating non-conforming development or continuation of non-conforming development differently, then getting some direction on that. And I think we were suggesting that whatever sort of standard or metric we come up with for demolitions, that it should be consistent for how we regulate non-conforming development. So happy to go through it, and everyone here is available to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, just to hop right on, when you speak about wall as getting the percentage from the walls, is that the area of the wall face or the linear length of the wall from a bird's eye view?
Yeah, I think that's something we would have to be pretty clear on to make it, reviewable. We've been mostly looking at wall area, I think, so far, in terms of preserving something recognizable of the existing structure on the site. But, there's complications to that. How do you, there's the perimeter, I think, would be another way you could measure that if we wanted to go that direction. I'm also not clear how we would be responding to openings in the wall, if there's any change in the openings of the wall, if we're looking at wall area, how that would factor in. It's a little more clear and objective to me than floor area percentage, but still would need some clarification.
And would it be accurate to say then, looking at the current demolition definitions, particularly the complete removal of the superstructure, that right now we're proposing, or what's being looked at is maybe 50%. What we're at now is more like 1%,
That's
or,
correct.
0.1%.
Yeah.
Enough of the wall that it is actually what you call a wall, Brian.
Yeah, probably more than one stud or a post. I mean, I've seen short walls that are only 3 studs, that's what we would call a wall, so.
Well, I think, in looking at this issue, it would be wise, in my view, to think about how to incorporate the demolition tax into this, because considering that it's quite new, just a couple of years old, I think many Oswegans could consider it, for lack of a better term, a cash grab to jump up to from 0% really to 50%, so soon after that's been implemented.
Yeah, and if I may, that's a really astute point. And I think when we visit with the city council, and there's a study session scheduled for March 17th on this, we're anticipating that they're going to want to talk about that too. And one of the concepts that this work group discussed, and actually the builder, Mr. Matthews, who was part of the group, and Ms. Oker, I think we're in agreement, if I can say that, perhaps allowing for some relief from that tax, or possibly even an exception to the tax for situations where there is a nonconformity that is being removed, that it's, the project's moving in the direction of full conformity. And, that's not something that we had brought as part of this package, because it would be, I think it would be a demolition tax policy for the council to weigh in on. I don't know if Carol had anything to add.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, and I do look forward to hearing what council's going to discuss on that.
Yeah, so we're definitely thinking about that, because that's not what this initiative is about.
Thank you.
Well, Director Siegel, one other question was, is this problem really unique to Lake Oswego? In fact, when we're looking at the middle housing code, they had provided some sample code. And so is the middle housing code not, considering this type of issue on what the definition is of a conversion, and for cities like Lake Oswego, that, this may present a problem. So that's relative to the middle housing. But what about just the other communities in general? Again, if we separate this from middle housing and say this is just an independent issue, is our code issue in Lake Oswego really unique from other cities? They don't have this problem?
Yeah, we're different. And if I may ask, I don't want to put Courtney Sims on the spot here. She did the research on the other communities, the other cities' codes that we looked at, and Courtney might want to answer that question.
Yeah, I did look at 6 other jurisdictions. Tigard and Tualatin have fairly similar ways that they approach nonconformity, but they review demolition as a result of the building value. And I think Jessica can talk about that. We used to do that.
Yeah, we used to do.
Yes, we used to base the percent. We basically, it said if you demolished more than 50% of the replacement value of the structure, the whole structure had to comply. But there were a lot of problems where, frankly, people could really cook the numbers. I mean, we had a lot of situations, or we had at least a couple of situations where the whole superstructure was demolished and all that was left was the foundation. And they found through evaluation that the foundation was more than 50% of the building cost. And they got to rebuild basically a brand new dwelling. It just wasn't working. And it's really very, very difficult for staff to administer, because evaluation subjective. So really trying to come up with something more clear and objective is important. And then just getting back to the question of what makes Lake Oswego unique, or are we unique? I would say in a way we are, because a lot of jurisdictions don't have the kind of complex infill standards that we have. So I think that as a proportion of our housing stock, we probably have a lot more nonconformities than, say Wilsonville, which is a lot of planned developments, which if their PDs work like ours do, they're locked in forever. Once, it's kind of like you're immune to code changes. And we do have planned developments in the city, but we have a lot of existing housing stock that are not planned developments, and a lot of nonconformities and a lot of complex code standards. So I think it's an issue we have to deal with more than maybe other jurisdictions might.
Yeah, and I just to add on to what Jessica was saying, when we adopted our demolition code or procedure in 2016, it was, as Brian was saying, the state had removed that from the state building code and then allowed cities to locally adopt their own demolition permit procedure, which we did. And it was really, I think, because it wasn't for these reasons, it was because the city was instituting this courtesy notice that we provide to neighbors as a way to, mitigate the disturbance of demolitions. And then eventually the city adopted a demolition tax. And we are the only jurisdiction in the state, I believe we're the only jurisdiction in the state, we were at least the first to adopt a demolition tax. So we have these other sort of policies that we're having to manage at the same time.
Thank you. Commissioner Stewart?
I'm actually gonna wait.
Okay. All right, Commissioner Stewart will stand. Maybe one, so we mentioned Tigard, we mentioned maybe the Tigard or Tualatin, we mentioned maybe how we did it in like Oswego. In the other communities, were there any other methods that were used for determining what's a demolition versus a conversion remodel?
Yeah, I think everyone received the, oh gosh, sorry, first time. I looked at Hillsborough, Westland, and then 2 communities in the Bay Area in California, Atherton and Woodside. A number of them had different methodologies. Tualatin and Tigard were similar in that they were fairly similar with nonconformity. Hillsborough seemed to look at 80% of structural value. Atherton was one of the few jurisdictions that had that looked at exterior wall removal as well as floor area removal. And I spoke to the planner there. He seemed to enjoy how it was working. And then they also had a tiered demolition fee for removal of structures. And then they're mostly residential, so they based their allowance of nonconformity to be based off of how dense the residential zone was. And so for the lower density residential, they required conformity with the code. But for the more dense areas, they allowed alterations and expansions within the nonconformity.
Yeah, there are other jurisdictions out there, other cities that allow expansion of non-conforming development, through a land use process like a conditional use permit or a variance. I think our approach is design-based. It's the design, residential infill design review variance or a minor variance, which is limited to typically like 20% of the setback.
Thank you. Commissioners, other questions? See no other questions?
So if the commissioners, if you have any feedback or thoughts around really the metrics, the percentages, we don't have any 50% is a pretty common standard that you see in codes, including non-conforming development standards, whether it's based on valuation or some other metric. But it's really a policy decision or recommendation, so we're really looking for your feedback on that. And then in terms of if you think that sort of this plan review approach and inspection process is something that we should pursue, we do recommend it.
Commissioner Stewart?
So I have concerns with the wording of the current definition. I think regardless of whether we decide on, say, a 50% or an 80%, or some number like that. To me, the term exterior walls and gross floor area could be construed to mean or include an exterior wall frame. So that one image that's popped up a couple times, that I think was in our staff report, where it showed basically the skeleton of the building and saying this is not a demolition. I think that still could be validated under a new definition as long as you're keeping the words exterior walls and gross floor area in it, because when you look at that picture, the gross floor area is still there because it's surrounded by the frame, and the exterior walls are all still there because the exterior skeleton is still there. So I think if you're talking about a 50% or an 80% removal of exterior walls, you have to somehow say that they can't take everything down to the skeleton, right? If that's what you really want. Because otherwise you're gonna be able to get around that.
So specifying the sheathing is.
Yeah, I'm not, and maybe this is where the building code official might kind of come into sort of helping you craft that definition, because I really think it's gotta, in my mind, planning requirements and building code requirements have got to be more married. They gotta use the same language because it just gets confusing otherwise. And so somehow, and I know the building code really doesn't define demolition, but it used to. And somehow the two have to work together better, because until they do, there will always be confusion.
Yeah. I think that picture is probably not the best picture right next to the definition. In the building world, we would require structural sheeting to support that wall. And in these new definitions, whatever would be created, we would define it as a structural wall that can withstand wind loading, and the empty studs, they can't prevent racking because they have no shear wall or no structural plywood to secure them. So we would be considering they need to leave that stuff up.
Right.
That's
And
part of the
think
structure.
You know what I'm getting at. I just think, I think there's more to it here than just saying 50 or 80%. We got to make sure that the wording is right.
That's why we're all working together on this.
Yeah.
If I could just add in while you're having this discussion, the ability in the suggested definition of allowing additional supports, I think is one that promotes this kind of taking an old wall, calling it an old wall, and yet creating it and turning it into a new wall, as long as, if maintenance is going to continue to allow adding additional support, then those old walls are going to keep being reinforced, and I think that's another problem going forward.
Thank you. Commissioners, any more comments or questions? Vice Chair Pepe, sorry, Mr.
Thanks, Chair. I was going down much of the same path that Commissioner Stewart and Commissioner Rigby were just discussing. And I don't know if what I had written down here was that somehow putting in, a percentage, whatever that may be, of load-bearing walls. If you went above that, then it would constitute demolition. It would be interesting to see more of the information from the city of Atherton on that tiered approach and how we can not make this come across as a money grab and make it to where we really want citizens to remodel and not demolish. And then also include in there the requirement in some way, shape, or form of deconstruction and salvage. how all that comes together. God bless you guys. This is not going to be an easy one to get through, but I do think we need to, as Commissioner Stewart was saying, we got to marry the words together very clearly, or we're going to come back to this here in the next couple of years.
All right, thank you. I see no other questions from commissioners. So next steps, Director Siegel, do we go into the next part of the discussion on
Sure.
schedule?
Yeah, so next step, so I think just to recap, I think what we're hearing is that both on the side of the demolition, defining demolition more appropriately, or however, what do you say, a duck is a duck, Commissioner Lee? It has to pass the duck as a duck test. And on the non-conforming development side, also looking at that, I think what I heard is that obviously the building technology is always changing. Planning codes are always changing. Our task is really to make sure that they're in sync, and that the language, the sort of the materials and the methods, the means and method will work. So whatever's specified in the planning code can be implemented by plan reviewers, whether they're in the building department or the planning department. I heard that we need to have a discussion. We will be having a discussion, I'm sure, with the council about the tax and this, I think, desire from Sustainability Advisory Board to look at deconstruction more thoroughly, because we do provide this credit or this incentive today for that. It hasn't been utilized. So I think there's a conversation to have around that. And then on the administrative side, I think what Jessica Murray Collins was being very polite, but I think she was calling our attention to the fact that this has a workload impact, and it could potentially have cost impact. And so that's a conversation. We need direction from the council as to whether whether we should be instituting additional process, and also being sensitive to turnaround times and review times for any new process that we provide. I also heard that, this is not coming from, a goal or a direction to raise revenue for the city. That's not what this is about. This is really about the council's goal to plan for growth and change and to maintain neighborhood qualities and quality of life. So we'll be looking at options. We'll look at those examples from the other cities to see how we can maybe develop a graduated approach, or a scaled approach, so that it's not disincentivizing the kind of outcomes that we're looking for, and at the same time it's not penalizing people, and it's not just raising money for. That's not really what this is about. And then I guess to wrap up on the process or the next steps, we do have a study session scheduled tentatively with the council on March 17th. So with your concurrence, commissioners, we would convey that feedback that we've received from you this evening. We'll probably continue to refine this working draft that we've been developing. The city is planning on issuing sort of what I would describe as an anticipatory public hearing notice, because when we do a public hearing notice for the House Bill 2001 code amendments, it requires almost a citywide notice. We have to notify every residentially zoned property in the city under Measure 56, because some of the code changes that are required for us to implement HB 2001, consistent with your direction and the council's direction, involves changes to development code that apply to all properties or all residentially zoned properties. So when we were developing this set of potential code amendments, we wanted to make sure that we could do that anticipatory notice for this at the same time we're doing that notice, in the event that the council, the commission and the council want us to move forward with some version of this. We've provided that notice.
Director Siegel.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not following. What's the anticipatory notice that you're referring to? Usually when we go through a plan commission, we talk about, we've had a work session, we've discussed the options that we want to consider, and then we give a hearing notice. This sounds like something different, though. What does this notice really call out? What type of are we giving notice for a hearing, that we're going to have a hearing on this, or is it that we anticipate that there'll be a hearing in the future.
Well, it's one notice that that's informing the property owner that you're having a hearing on the HB 2001 code amendments on April 11th. And then there's a second section that says hearing on non-conforming, not demolition, but non-conforming development regulations. And subject to direction we get from city council, that hearing will either go forward or not go forward.
Yeah, and that would be sometime in the future. It wouldn't be.
That would be, tentatively, that would be April 11th.
Oh, April 11th.
Right.
Yeah, my only concern is that we're just getting into this, we're exploring the options, there's a lot of questions. It just seems like to go to a hearing now or that quickly, it seems a little bit quick.
Okay, well, with your direction, we would not move on that. Iris says that copy can be changed. They haven't printed it. Debatable. Well, the hearing wouldn't go forward without your approval, obviously. But there is those notices are city. They're not inexpensive. So if the council were wanting to go forward with the hearing, even if the hearing were later in the year, we may be required to re-notify that. Yeah, but if it's within, I think if it's within 40 days of the notice, then we can go forward with that hearing. Otherwise, we would re-notify, and it's in the, I think, how much was the last notice that we? Over $10,000 for city measure 56 notice. So anyway, we're just trying to allow you to kind of move forward on either track, either having a hearing or scheduling it further out.
Yeah, I'm kind of under the opinion that I think for this, with all the questions we have, it seems like maybe another work session to go through. I think what Commissioner Rigby was asking earlier, what are the options we're considering? Looking at those options, how do we frame them for a public hearing? What do we want to, have considered? The other comment I was going to have as you were summarizing was, and I think maybe this is understood by the commissioners and staff and others, is that I would suspect that the options, it wouldn't be a single option to say, it's strictly looking at wall size, that it may be, as we look at it as a commission, a set of options that are put into or conditions, like I think the current code was when we were first looking at it, saying, it involved superstructure plus a couple other conditions that, as we as a commission look at this, it won't hinge on maybe one single condition like wall area or percentage. It could be a set of conditions that we look at. And if we put those together, it would solve. But I think those are the type of options that we need to look and get, feedback from the community on.
Okay. So looking at your schedule then, currently you have an update on goals on the 14th, and then on the 28th, there's a work session tentatively scheduled with the West Lake Grove Village Center group that's working on code amendments there. So, conceivably we could be back before you with some more options for your next meeting, if you'd like. We could do that.
I think that would be good. Yeah, I don't know if other commissioners want to weigh in on that, but I think, this is a complex, matter, and, kind of going through, looking at more options, kind of working through the details of, would benefit us by, taking the time to look at all the different options. Commissioners, any comments? Vice Chair Pepe?
Yeah, I would completely agree with what Chair Heap was just saying. It does feel very rushed, and I think we should take our time with a deadline, of course, but I think the deadline that's proposed is a little too quick. I think having another work session on this would be very beneficial.
Commissioner Rigby, did you have?
I was just pointing out.
Oh, okay, thank you. All right.
Okay, thank you.
So we conclude tonight's work session, and we'll move on to the next agenda item. Yeah, other business. Is there any other business that we want to discuss tonight? It was kind of going back to the community involvement. So I think we gave an update on kind of our goals, and we had some questions come in related to goals and the interest of seeing. I think council was releasing their goals, and then the question is, well, you know, what is the plan commission? How does the plan commission goals factor into that? And so there's a lot of interest in, seeing what our plan commission goals are. We said we're going to address that next meeting. But there's one other thing that came up I wanted to just mention was, you know, tonight, the other part of this was sustainability. And I know as we're looking at sustainability for one of our goals, we looked at adding more chargers. And there was some general discussion I want to at least mention that out on Avenue A, the chargers are actually broken. And so as we go through our sustainability work, I think that's something we got to look at is, you know, our whole process there. The parking, as we've heard, is very valuable to Lake Oswego. And now we have a situation where it's, the parking is reserved for electric cars. And I think we may have talked about this once before, about kind of reserving this and the impact it has on the community. But with the broken chargers, now nobody can park there. And also it's my understanding that there's a certain manufacturer that's actually put those in. I'm not sure what the maintenance agreement is with that, but you know, it's not getting repaired quickly. It's been broken for some time. Good question. I think they're just getting used, my opinion. I don't know, but my opinion from using them and seeing them there is that they're used very heavily, and people tend to pull on the cords. So they start coming out, the ends of the cords that actually go up into the chargers start coming out, and so they were kind of breaking from that perspective. But I think you know, going back to the goals, as we look at charging and the options for that, I think that has a lot of impacts, and so received some comments from the community on like what's going on with that. We look forward to the work for that in the commission. So that's it. I didn't have anything else on other business. Director Siegel, any?
No other business, thanks.
Anything else on, we'll move on to the schedule review. Any other updates for schedule review?
I think I've already provided it. So your next meeting is an update on goals, and then the 28th, or the second meeting in March, is the work session tentatively with the West Lake Grove Village Center group.
I just add that I'll be on vacation, and so Jason Luce will be covering for me.
Is that at our next meeting, Attorney Boone, or is that the meeting for the 28th?
For March 8.
The first meeting in March?
Well, yeah, the first meeting in March, like 12, whatever it is.
Okay, thank you.
He's a city attorney for those who don't, my boss.
We look forward to seeing him at our plan commission meeting. Thank you for the notice. All right, if nothing else, then we'll adjourn the meeting. Meeting's adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.